The Android operating system has been put on an iPhone, and today's guest is Nick Lee, who accomplished that strange feat. In the past, Nick has put Windows 95 on an Apple Watch as well. Why would you do something like this? But more importantly, how do you do it? In today's interview with Nick, we talk about the technical challenges of bringing Nick's bizarre sense of technological irony into reality with the Android operating system being put on an iPhone. But before we get to this episode, some quick announcements. The Software Engineering Daily community has started working on a project called Software Daily. We are building an open source news and information site about software. And if you're a web developer, whether you're working with React.js or Flux architecture or Node.js, you might want to check out the Software Daily repo at softwaredaily.com. And if you want to contribute to Software Engineering Daily in a different way, you can also find out how to become a host for Software Engineering Daily. You can find links to the Slack channel. You can find links to my Twitter account and my email, and these would be on softwareengineeringdaily.com. You can also sign up for the newsletter on softwareengineeringdaily.com, which features the content that the Software Engineering Daily team is checking out on a weekly basis. And with that, let's get to this episode about Android on iPhone after a quick message from our sponsors. I had a crazy idea a couple weeks ago. It's a photo sharing app that only has pictures of cats. When I finish my photo sharing cat application, I will be deploying it to Linode because Linode is the fastest hosted Linux provider. I don't want to get locked into a proprietary platform that's going to overcharge me as soon as my app gets popular. I just want a fast Linux server with simple pricing. Go to linode.com/sedaily and get $20 in free credit today. Plans start at $10 a month, so my free $20 will be plenty to launch my cat photo sharing app. Once I need to scale, I can use tools like node balancers and backups, and Linode has built-in dashboarding and metrics so that I can see the traffic to my Linode servers, and I can understand how many of my users are posting cat pictures and looking at each other's cat pictures. Go to linode.com/sedaily and get $20 in free credit today. The plans start at $10 a month, so it's a great deal. Thanks to Linode for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Now let's get on to this episode. Nick Lee is the CTO at Tendigi. Nick, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Today we're talking about putting one thing on another, and by that I mean you put Android on an iPhone, and you have also put Windows 95 on an Apple Watch. So I want to talk about these things as well as just the overall ethos of why you do this type of stuff. So let's start with the Android on iPhone. You put Android on an iPhone. Why would you do this?
Okay, so this is kind of the overarching theme of all the YouTube comments I've received, all the hate mail I've gotten, has pretty much been the motif has been why, and the main reason is that I don't think there's ever been two platforms, at least in my lifetime, that have had such polarized audiences that with such animosity for each other as Android and iOS. So it just seemed kind of natural to want to smash them together as hard as possible.
Okay, so it's natural maybe from a ideological standpoint, but does it have any technological usage that actually would be practical?
I suppose it does. I mean, one of the attributes of Android that camp always pushes is that it's open and you can do anything with it, and you don't have to, there's no App Store approval process of the same kind of magnitude that Apple's is. So, the ability to kind of run whatever software you want, the ability to do things like tethering, there are actual practical applications to having Android available on your iPhone.
At a high level, how do you do this? How do you get Android on an iPhone?
Okay, so my initial plan was to try to figure out some way to actually run it on the iPhone's hardware directly. Obviously, that would have been, the kind of the most ideal situation, because you wouldn't have to deal with a big bulky case that needs its own battery and its own electronics. But that ended up being, just kind of an initial look into beginning to do that would have been really complicated. All of Apple's everything end to end with the iPhone is pretty much closed source. As far as the bootloader, the kernel, it's all kept very tightly under wraps by Apple. But I still wanted to make it happen. So the next route I pursued basically was, for all intents and purposes, constructing a headless Android phone that sits in a little case underneath the iPhone. And just has a network connection basically to a host application that runs on the phone.
So to clarify, you have the iPhone sitting in this case, and the case within it has a board that is running Android. The Android board is connected via USB to the proprietary Apple cord, and that's plugged into the iPhone, and essentially it's running Android, and it's virtualizing the Android experience on the iPhone, and the iPhone is still reading touch events and translating those to Android. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and it's reading the video frames back. It's just like VNC or Microsoft Remote Desktop. It's that principle.
Okay, so let's assume this is a useful project. Why hasn't somebody done this sooner?
That's a good question. I think the first reason is to do something like this. Like if you were to actually do it in production and not just like a quick and dirty hack like I did, you basically have to become a mobile phone manufacturer. And that's obviously a non-trivial exercise. And that's the reason we really haven't thought about putting it into production, is just because it's such a large undertaking to develop a piece of hardware of this complexity. And also, as far as why more hobbyists haven't done it, it required a kind of fairly involved deconstruction of the Android operating system. Like I wasn't able to use any off-the-shelf Android ROMs. I had to build the operating system from source myself. I had to do a lot of digging into kind of the graphics architecture to be able to grab the frames, fast enough that they could be transmitted over USB, so the iPhone could read them. There was a decent amount of technical complexity, which, for something that isn't going to go into production, would probably turn some people off.
You did end up making yourself into an Android manufacturer, essentially, and we should get into that. So the project was made possible by the fact that the entire Android operating system is open source. Why is the fact that Android is open source so important to this project? So I would call that Android's killer app almost, is the fact that it's open source. And what that lets you do is that lets you modify the operating system on its absolute core levels. So, to grab kind of the raw video frames that are being displayed on the screen, you have to get pretty close to the metal if you want to do that in some kind of performant way. And without being able to modify the operating system's internals, there really wouldn't be any way to do that. Similarly, to talk to the iPhone, there's actually a great open source project out there called USB MuxD, which I read about in the blog post a little bit. And basically what that does is that's an open source daemon that communicates to the iPhone using Apple's proprietary protocols. And because that's open source and it's used to using Linux USB drivers, it was pretty easy to port to Android. And because the Android operating system is open source, it was easy to include it into my build. So we'll get into some more of the software internals, but talking more about the ecosystem, there's something called the Open Handset Alliance, which maintains the open source Android project. Give me an overview of the Android open source ecosystem and what the Open Handset Alliance does.
Sure. So I'm certainly not the most well versed on that topic, but my understanding is that The Open Handset Alliance is basically a partnership between some open source developers, Google, and handset manufacturers, and my guess is probably software manufacturers as well. And it's I would call it something of a standards organization where they all agree about what they're going to support and what interfaces they're going to deal with, and it allows Android to be somewhat standardized from manufacturer to manufacturer. Obviously, it's not the same level. There's more fragmentation than you'd get with a company like Apple, where they control everything. But it gets them closer to kind of a homogeneous experience.
Okay, so you tested this project by prototyping on a Nexus 5. Why is an Android device an adequate target to test something that you were trying to build for an Apple device?
Well, if you really think about it, I was still building for an Android device. Most of the software development that I had to do was actually for the board that sits in the case, which is basically, for all intents and purposes, a headless Android phone. But before I had that board, I started with the Nexus 5 because it was, it wasn't the absolute latest model phone. It had specs that are not considered state of the art anymore. So I assumed it would be a kind of a good baseline target to develop for. And then once I kind of had a proof of concept that you could remotely control an Android phone over USB from an iPhone, then I moved into making custom hardware.
That term headless Android, explain what that means.
Okay, I mean, that basically means, most Android phones, they have a motherboard, they have a battery, and then they have a touchscreen. Since the iPhone in this case is providing the touchscreen, that isn't a necessary part of the hardware. So obviously that cuts down things like battery consumption. It cuts down drivers you have to write. So what I ended up going with was an Android development board that only has video out. It doesn't have a built-in touchscreen. And
nobody had done this before?
Not to my knowledge. It's possible that somebody's figured it out somewhere, but certainly they haven't leveraged the media in the way I did.
Aren't there like Android TVs and other kinds of objects that don't really have the same? I guess even an Android TV, it's not headless because you have the monitor.
Yeah, I mean the board I used is specifically designed to be an Android, it's designed for people who are working on the operating system. So it's kind of Google's reference hardware that you're supposed to target before you start going to individual phones.
Okay, so there are several components that you had to port for Android, and I want to go through these. Mm-hmm. The first is Libby Mobile Device, which lets you communicate natively with iOS devices. Describe what Libby Mobile Device does and how that fits into this project.
Sure. So it's really LibI Mobile Device, as iPhone, iPod Touch, iPad.
Ah, yes. Okay.
And it basically, in developing the syncing mechanism for all those devices, Apple created a bunch of proprietary protocols that they use. And they all talk over USB pretty much. And LibI Mobile Device is basically a series of libraries that emulate those native protocols. And they're open source, so you can port them to whatever you need to run them on.
So Apple publishes maybe a spec or an interface for
Apple doesn't publish any of that. As far as I can tell, the LibI Mobile Device developers had to reverse engineer most of that from either sniffing packets across the wire or disassembling Apple's binaries and kind of seeing how those protocols work, because Apple doesn't make any of this stuff public.
Okay, so are there bugs in that protocol? Like how thoroughly can you reverse engineer something like that?
It's hard to know for sure because, like I said, Apple hasn't really documented it, so it's really hard to tell. But in my testing, it's been around for a while. The project, they've kept up with with updates that Apple's made as they introduce new hardware, and it seemed to be pretty reliable to me.
This begs the question: is there an entire culture around hacking and decomposing these types of proprietary Apple products?
There absolutely is, and it's to some extent a subset of the iPhone jailbreaking community. There's a lot of overlap between this stuff and those people, and the reason why is because one of the features of this libimobile device series of libraries is that it has components that let you browse the file system on iOS, because there's actually Apple has an interface that lets you do that. So things like that are useful to jailbreak developers. So sometimes they'll contribute to these projects and vice versa.
Okay, so another component of this Android version that you built is USB Mux-D. You mentioned this a little earlier, and this allows you to use a USB cable to effectively communicate between Android and iPhone.
Yeah.
So explain what you had to do to get a TCP connection between Android and iPhone.
Sure. So USB Mux-D, the real USB Mux-D, is actually a daemon that ships with macOS 10 that is used to communicate with Apple's iDevices. And basically what it does is it will, say you have on your iPhone, there's processes listening to TCP ports, running in the background. One of those processes might be responsible for syncing your iTunes library. One of them might be responsible for installing applications when you run them from Xcode. Another one might be, responsible for syncing your calendar. What USB Mux-D does is it allows you to turn the USB connection between your computer and the iPhone into basically a multiplexed network connection. So you can communicate directly with those processes, but the interface is kind of all hidden from you. All you know is you're writing to a socket and it's ending up on the iPhone on the other side. And part of libimobile device is actually an open source clone of USB Mux-D, which does the same thing, but obviously since it's open source and designed for Linux-based operating systems, it was portable to Android, and that's really what enabled this, because USB is much faster than pretty much any Wi-Fi, and the latency is much lower as well.
Okay, and in order to get the actual iPhone screen to display the contents of Android, which are being sent to it over TCP, you wrote a daemon called Screen Streamer. What does Screen Streamer do?
So that process sits on the Android side. And pretty much what that does is it connects to an Android API on the operating system level called Surface Flinger. And what it does is it reads full video frames out of Surface Flinger, and it sends them out over the USB cable to the iPhone. It doesn't do any compression or anything like that. It didn't seem to be necessary at the resolutions I was running at. The USB is 480 megabits per second, which was more than enough to get those video frames over. What Screen Streamer also does is it reads in over that USB connection touch events, and it emulates them.
And my impression is that the screen, I guess I could have looked this up beforehand, but the screen size is not identical on the iPhone and the Nexus. Is that accurate?
Actually, on the Nexus it is. At least for the iPhone 6 Plus, which I have. I believe they both have native resolutions of 1920 by 1080.
So there were no translation issues there?
When I was using the Nexus, no. However, when I started using the dev board, I believe there's a known issue with its with something in the bootloader or something in the video hardware, I don't remember, that prevents it from running at that resolution. So it's actually running, I think, at 800 by 600, which is why you see the letterboxing in the video.
Letterboxing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can see the there's black lines on both the top and the bottom of the screen if you look at the video that was on YouTube and everywhere.
Okay. So how responsive are the touch events when you have Android up and running on the iPhone and you touch something? Like, is there noticeable latency relative to how it is on, iPhone running iPhone?
It's not too bad. It's about, I'd say we get about 15 to 20 frames per second. And yeah, it's totally usable. It's not as fast, obviously, as an Android phone would be, if you were just using a normal Android phone, but it's pretty good.
Okay, so once you got the iPhone displaying and communicating with the Android Nexus 5, what did you do next?
After that, once I had a proof of concept that demonstrated that this could be done, that I could control an Android phone or something running Android from iOS, the next step was to build custom hardware that could fit into a case on the back of the phone. And that's when I started researching different boards that could run Android. And that's when I came across the board I ended up using, which is called the High Key. And that's from a company called LeeMaker. And like I was telling you before, that's the official, as far as I can tell, the official reference board that Google suggests when developing the Android operating system.
Okay, so you wanted to, get this iPhone compatible with an Android board. What were some of the challenges that you encountered trying to extrapolate from the prototype version of the Android Nexus 5 doing this versus the Android board?
Let me think. There were some... honestly, by the time I made it to the reference board, I had most of the challenging aspects of it worked out. The biggest one, let me think. It was a while ago now. We can edit this out too.
Sure. No, totally. I mean, I could just skip to the next question. So, I mean, sure. you got the Android board running and hooked into the iPhone, and it was actually running. You actually had Android running on an iPhone. So you wanted to build an enclosure to house the Android board and actually make this sort of a usable device rather than a board and an iPhone that you would both have to carry around. So how did you build the enclosure for that Android board? Sure.
So before I got into kind of the world of 3D printing, I wanted to see if there was a way to have it manufactured for me, because at the time I knew nothing about 3D printing or CAD or 3D design or anything. And the more I looked into it, the more I discovered that it's to get something like that produced, just for low volume, meaning one or two of them, it was really kind of prohibitively expensive for just a quick hacky project like this. And as a result, that kind of forced me into the world of 3D printing. So, one day I decided I went to B&H here in Manhattan. I picked up one of the cheapest 3D printers they had. I set up Google SketchUp, and, a couple days later, after, taking some measurements and learning how to use SketchUp, which is a CAD-ish program, I was printing prototype enclosures, and I just started playing with the measurements until I got it as small as I could.
So once you had this enclosure built, you had an iPhone running Android, and this was sitting in a big bulky case. You had accomplished your goal. Did you start using it as your default phone? Did you start testing it and walking around with it and seeing if it would function like you needed it to?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I still carry it around from time to time. Actually, what was a lot of fun, the story broke right before WWDC, which is Apple's kind of annual international developers conference that they hold in San Francisco. And the fun part was that, it had been all over the media for the couple days prior to WWDC. So I was walking around with it there. And, everybody knew what it was. And it was, I met some cool people, and it was fun to talk to people about it. But yeah, I carry it around sometimes. Honestly, I didn't really build this because I needed to have it. I built it because I wanted to see if it was possible. So, it's not like there was some need I had that required me to carry it.
Well, this project was certainly atypical for a mobile developer. Given that you engaged with both Android and iPhone on this project, and you really got to taste the internals of these operating systems up close, how do you feel that the two platforms differ as a developer? I mean, you mentioned, for example, the fact that this one protocol had to be reverse engineered in order to actually make it usable. And you also mentioned that Android, the killer feature is that the code is open source. Is the killer feature of iPhone that the code is not open source? Is that somehow an equivalent asset to the platform?
I would say yes. I think on the iPhone, kind of the advantage is that it's a closed ecosystem, and Apple controls it end to end. And as a result, they're able to, and there's a very small selection of hardware that it runs on, and as a result, they're able to ensure a relatively consistent experience for pretty much everybody. Obviously, the downside is you can't do much customization, and the converse is true on Android. You can customize it all you want, and you can use it for all sorts of applications it was never intended for. You could build a point of sale system on Android, as people have with there's one called Clover. You could build an industrial automation system that runs Android. You can't do any of these things with iOS because it's not open. But obviously, the downside is that there's more when things go wrong. There's more maintenance that you have to do, and the odds that your problem case is the same as somebody else's are lower, since there's a greater possibility for deviation from the norm.
Wealthfront is an automated investing service that saves you time. As an engineer, your time is valuable. If you want to invest, but you don't want to spend significant time evaluating your portfolio and allocating assets, take a look at Wealthfront. Go to wealthfront.com/SEDaily to open an account today and get a special offer for Software Engineering Daily listeners. $15,000 managed for free when you open your account. With traditional investment services, there are many humans in the loop that are doing things that Wealthfront automates away. When you pay the commissions and account fees of these traditional investment services, you're paying for work that could be done by a computer. So don't pay commissions and account fees. Maximize your gains with Wealthfront's Set It and Forget It investment automation. Check out wealthfront.com/SEDaily. It would support Software Engineering Daily, and it would introduce you to the world of automated investing. Wealthfront.com/SEDaily. Thanks to Wealthfront for being a continued sponsor of the show. Now let's get on with the show. So you are talking about the consistent experience among iOS devices. My impression is that the experience is actually not that consistent. You have a consistent experience among all of the highest end Apple devices at a given time, but over time that consistency degrades. And my experience with the high-end Android devices is that that's essentially the same. Is that if you have the highest end Nexus device, you're going to have a top quality experience, despite the fact that it is an open ecosystem. And if you have an older iPhone, you're going to have a degraded experience. If you have an older Nexus device, you're going to have a degraded experience. Can you give me a little more of your impression of what you mean by this consistency of experience?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think one kind of factor that impacts things on the Android side, though, is that if you look at the overall Android user base, and I haven't looked at these statistics in a while, so please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but a much smaller percentage of users are running these latest phones, and there's so many other phones to support compared to when Apple releases a new phone, there's one new phone that's the flagship one that has features you can take advantage of. On Android, there's maybe 15 different manufacturers all releasing top of the line phones, all with different specs, all with different hardware features. So it's harder to get that same consistency. What you said is true, though. Obviously, as Apple releases new phones with new features, software. Old features become deprecated. Software doesn't support old phones. Software requires features that are new phones. So yeah, you still get that. But I think overall it ends up being more consistent. And also, I think Apple users, if you look at the numbers, Apple users are a little bit better about upgrading to the latest, both hardware and software.
So it sounds like you're saying that the cultural aspects of the iPhone community are driven by that closed ecosystem. And so whether or not this is a fundamental technological causal relationship on the Apple side, the end result is that more Apple users end up with a high quality experience. Whether they've been strong armed into buying the latest Apple devices or not is a different question. But more Apple users end up with a high quality, consistent experience.
Yeah, I think that's the net effect of the way the ecosystem works. And as someone who's developed relatively extensively for both platforms and shipped software for a lot of clients that have wanted experiences on both platforms, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to do it on iOS because of the fragmentation.
Okay. So you actually have a history of putting strange operating systems on Apple hardware. Back in April, you put Windows 95 on an Apple Watch. So, I would ask you the same question I asked about Android on iPhone. Why would you do that?
That honestly, that made even less sense. That was really, I had been doing some research into reverse engineering the way the watch operating system works, and there's actually an excellent blog post by the esteemed iOS developer Stephen Troughton-Smith, where he did some poking around as well. And I don't know how much you know about watchOS and Apple's WatchKit SDK, but you're extremely limited with what you can do with it. And what I mean by that is things that you'd find trivial on most other platforms, like building a custom user interface control or getting the location of the user's finger. You can't do out of the box with WatchKit. Apple pretty much gives you their controls, and that's what you can use. So basically, the kind of the kernel of inspiration that got me to porting an emulator to the watch was the discovery that you can actually modify the applications Xcode generates for the watch before installing them, and actually inject your own user interface. And once I discovered that got me really excited, and I wanted to see what outrageous thing I could do with it.
And it was indeed outrageous, having Windows 95 on Apple Watch. So you just basically wanted to test some sort of different interface on there. You decided to throw up Windows 95. Windows 95 is such an interesting choice because I have such a sense of nostalgia about Windows 95.
As do I. Windows 95 came out 2 years after I was born, and it was the first operating system I ever used. So yeah, I agree with you. I remember when my family, we got our Gateway 2000. It showed up in a big, cow-colored box. We set it up, and I saw, when I was probably 5 years old, I saw the Windows 95 logo on a screen. So yeah, it has a personal nostalgic significance to me as well.
Yeah, and before the show, we were talking a little bit, and you mentioned something called a Hit Clips player, which was this is another nostalgic piece of technology. If anybody doesn't know what Hit Clips are, you should look them up. It's pretty hilarious. But there are all these technologies of the 90s, maybe even early 2000s that are so funny to look at in retrospect because they just make no sense anymore.
You're totally right. Do you remember the Q Cat from Radio Shack?
No, I don't. What's that?
Man, that was a cat-shaped barcode reader that plugged into between your keyboard and your and the PS2 port on your computer. And the idea was that like every catalog, every food product would have this like special barcode on it that you could read with this thing. And like Radio Shack would give them out for free. I must have 50 of them at my parents' house. Like it's crazy.
These technologies that we're nostalgic about, and I feel like there's also an internet subculture around these, probably at least as large as the internet subculture around reverse engineering proprietary iPhone protocols. It's pretty funny I think there's lots of like Tumblr blogs about these things that are pretty
Yeah, there absolutely are.
How does the hardware on an Apple Watch compare to that of a desktop computer in the 90s when Windows 95 was prominent as an actual usable operating system?
Well, if you were to look at kind of the raw numbers, it's quite favorable. As far as RAM goes, the Apple Watch has 512 megabytes of RAM on board, which is the size of some hard drives in the 90s. It also has 8 gigs of storage, which is, which would have been very expensive in a desktop computer at the time. Also, the processor, I think, I don't remember exactly, but I think it's around somewhere in the 500 megahertz range, which, when 95 came out was, I don't think servers were even that fast. I remember, back to my parents' Gateway 2000 that they bought, that was 300 megahertz. I think it had 256 megs of RAM and a 10 gig hard drive, and that was a $3,500 computer. So, if you were to look at the raw specs, the Apple Watch which is 38 millimeters sitting on your wrist, is way more powerful than even the flagship desktop computers of the time.
Amazing. So we don't need to walk through the Windows 95 on Apple Watch technical details in as much depth as we did with Android on iPhone, but at a high level, what were the steps that you took to run Windows 95 on the Watch OS?
So there was really just one, but it was a big step. And that was taking the Box, spelled BOCHS, x86 computer emulator, which is open source, and porting it to watchOS. And there wasn't really that much involved there because somebody had already ported it to the iPhone. So it was really just a matter of taking the iOS port and massaging it a little bit so it would run on the watch.
Okay, so you emulated Windows 95. I read the blog post, and the emulation is different than virtualization. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah, I mean, in layman's terms, virtualization, usually you're dealing with the same processor architecture of the virtualized operating system as well as the host hardware. So say you have a new Mac and you want to run Windows in VMware or Parallels, because both of those, target Intel processors, both OS X and Windows, and the computer is an Intel processor as well, there's no translation that needs to happen. The instructions that Windows is expecting can be run, directly on the host computer's processor. Emulation, on the other hand, as is the case with the Apple Watch has an ARM processor, which has a totally different instruction set than Windows computers or IBM compatible computers of the 90s had. So what has to happen with emulation is that software has to actually translate the instructions that Windows is expecting into the instructions that the watch's processor is expecting, and it also has to translate the other way as well once it gets the results back. And obviously because that's done in software, that introduces a lot of CPU overhead and a lot of latency into the mix.
Okay, so before you did the Windows 95 on Apple Watch project, you also did a project where you got an older version of Mac OS running on the watch. Mac OS is an operating system that ran on Apple computers in the 90s. How did the engineering of Windows 95 on the watch compare to Mac OS on the watch?
It was a lot more difficult. Mainly because I think
Mac OS was more difficult.
no, Windows 95 was more difficult.
Okay.
And I think because, as funny as it is to say, Windows 95 actually requires a much more powerful system than OS 10, or not OS 10, I believe it was OS 7.5 did at the time. So, getting it to testing it was a much more drawn out process since it required more power and therefore the emulation was slower and it took longer to boot.
Oh my God, that's right. I remember reading that in the blog post where you were booting it up and it just took like an hour to...
Yeah, and I figured out the reason why actually this year at WWDC, because if you were just doing, if you were doing the math and even if you worked out, what the kind of CPU instruction translations added, in theory, it shouldn't take anywhere near that long. People actually posted responses on YouTube to my video where they found ARM-based, Chromebooks and things that had similar specs to the Apple Watch and showed Windows 95 booting in a couple of minutes. And they were like, Nick is wrong. He must have done something wrong. And I eventually discovered that the reason it's so slow is because Apple, in an effort to conserve battery life on the watch, actually throttles the amount of CPU each individual process can use. And that's why it takes an hour.
Wow. Huh. So when you mention WWDC, it makes me wonder, what is the response from the Apple people when you talk to them about this?
I think they've been told not to have a response. So, Apple and I have a kind of a long storied history of mutual reflexive aggression, but I think they find it clever and they find it trolly, and they otherwise choose not to acknowledge it. But I've gotten word from several Apple employees, on both sides of the spectrum. Either it's you're horrible. Why have you done such an awful thing? And this is really cool. It made me think.
You're horrible. Why have you done such a thing? So there really are these fanatical Apple purists.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's almost a direct quote. Like, they exist, and vice versa. Like for the Android thing as well. Like, there were people who were like, "Why would you run such a great OS on such terrible hardware?" And any publicity is good publicity, as far as I'm concerned.
How big is the contingent of fanatic? I mean, maybe we don't even need to go into the ideologue discussion. But okay, so we kind of discussed Android versus iOS in the paradigm of the phone. What about in the paradigm of the watch?
You're talking about Android Wear versus watchOS?
Yeah, like in terms of both developer ergonomics and end user consumability.
So I haven't spent too much time with Android Wear. I would like to, because as far as I'm aware, I've looked at the developer documentation a little bit, and it looks like you have a lot more options as far as the things you can develop for it. They give you, I think, a lot more access to the hardware. They give you access to things like Wi-Fi, which on the Apple Watch you don't really get in a transparent way. They give you access to like the microphone directly, the speaker directly, which Apple is starting to do. But I think in terms of creating kind of rich experiences that are more than just heads up informational, I think Android Wear gives you a lot more opportunities there.
So my impression is that the Apple, despite that fact, the Apple Watch has much more adoption than any of the Android watches. Have you seen any numbers? Do you know about adoption?
I really haven't, unfortunately.
I just never see anybody with an Android
Once in a
watch.
while, and they're always like the IT guy with the calculator watch. Like,
That's right.
Yeah, I was shocked the other day. I was in New Jersey, and I was at a kind of a random deli somewhere by the Tappan Zee Bridge, and I saw somebody walk in with a $17,000 Apple Watch edition, and that was shocking to me.
The gold one.
The gold one, yeah.
Wow. New Jersey person who probably commutes to an investment banking job in New York or something. I don't know.
Almost certainly.
Almost certainly. So how do you teach yourself to reverse engineer this type of stuff? Like, I consider myself a software engineer. I would have no idea where to begin. I mean, like, this is not like a React JS type of thing where I could just read a tutorial and figure out how to do this. How do you maybe this has something to do with your upbringing, or why are you a reverse engineer like this?
That's a good question. I think it's certainly an aspect of my personality, for better or for worse. But I don't know. I enjoy taking things that are very nicely to get put together and polished, and often somewhat closed, and finding ways of either making them worse or making them impractical or somehow taking them apart. And Apple's products are such a great candidate for that, because so many people have them, so many people know what they are. If you write a headline that talks about doing something with an Apple product, everyone's going to pick it up because everyone's interested. So I mean, that's pretty much the motivation behind it, is that it's something a lot of people find interesting. As far as actually doing it goes, it's really just a matter of looking at what you got, looking at what Apple gives you, whether it's a binary that you made in Xcode that you want to see how it's been assembled and what it links to and what you can have it linked to instead, or whatever. It's just a matter of kind of analyzing what you have, seeing what you recognize in what you have, and kind of following things from there.
The pendulum has swung between open and closed ecosystems over time, and this is iconic in the Apple versus Android debate. But the time horizon of when however long we've had this closed versus open ecosystem debate is not even that long. It's like maybe 20 or 30 years. So it's not necessarily an immutable trend. Do you think that this is going to continue for time immemorial, like closed versus open, or are we going to eventually have entirely open, like just much more open predominance?
I'm sorry, you Jeff, you cut out a little bit in the middle of that question. Can
Oh,
you
okay.
repeat it?
Oh, sorry. Well, I was saying, so the closed versus open pendulum has swung back and forth for the longest time, but we haven't even had computers for an extremely long time. So do you think that the closed versus open paradigm is going to continue to shift back and forth, or are we going to eventually settle on having one or the other? We're going to have more openness or more closeness?
That's a good question. I don't know how closely you followed. I think Apple is probably the best example of kind of mainstream proprietary closed stuff, platforms for consumers. Obviously, Microsoft has a long history of that as well, but a lot of their stuff is in the enterprise. I think I don't know how closely you followed WWDC this year, but it seems like things are moving in the direction, even proprietary products are moving in the direction of being more open. If you look at what they're doing with apps that never had any extension points before, Apple's opening up the Messages app, they're opening up notifications, they're opening up even their development environment on OS X with the ability to write extensions for that. So I mean, it depends how you define open. If you define open as open source, I think as long as people are creating software, we're not going to, some of it's going to be closed source and proprietary, and that's fine. But I think there is an overall trend in allowing people to customize things for their applications, regardless of whether or not the source code is actually available.
Well, what's funny about the Apple ecosystem is I feel like Apple could open source so much more of this, and it would not injure their bottom line at all, because the bottom line is not really about the ecosystem being closed. It's about the ecosystem being really, really well supported and really well invested and really well thought about. And if they don't open it up more, then the one thing I think about is like the whole machine learning stuff. Like I remember reading a while ago, like there are no machine learning researchers that want to go work at Apple because they can't publish anything. They can't really interact with anybody in the outside community. And the machine learning community is moving so fast, and it's such a big kind of holistically intertwined community that should reach beyond the borders of a particular company. But I don't know. Maybe that's a couple of different conversations bundled.
I mean, I don't know. It's
hard to say. Okay, this is not a prognostication TechCrunch style podcast. So let's talk a little more about what you are doing. So what is Tendigi?
Day to day, we are a mobile design and development studio. So we build for our clients typically native mobile applications, though we also do a fair amount of web development and a fair amount of hardware prototyping. And we work with all sorts of different kinds of clients. Our smallest client is one guy in his apartment in San Francisco. Our largest client is Viacom. So, all projects of all shapes and sizes, clients of all shapes and sizes, and challenges of all shapes and sizes.
My understanding is that the hardware prototyping landscape is getting really, really, really easy and really democratized. Is that true?
Yeah, certainly a lot more than it was a few years ago. For simple hardware, you have all sorts of open products that you can use, like Arduinos, that let you prototype all sorts of kind of basic electronics. And if you want to get more involved than that, there's a lot more powerful boards out there that let you prototype all sorts of stuff. Intel's got a few of them. The one I use for the Android project's one of them. There's obviously Raspberry Pis. Hardware prototyping is really moving fast.
When you're talking about prototyping, is that so? Like, what would be the model for going from a prototype to something that would be mass produced? Could you just send the prototype to somebody in Shenzhen and say, "Hey, make 1 million of these"?
Having consulted a couple clients on that process, it's never that easy. It's usually there's a fair amount of work that needs to happen between, a prototype you built with some off-the-shelf microcontrollers and something that can be mass-produced. But it's, compared to how it used to be, where you actually needed to get the manufacturer to do the prototype for you as well. It's a lot easier to get started in the process.
Okay. So I guess last question: how does the type of work that you do on the side, like throwing Windows 95 on an Apple Watch or Android on iOS, how does that dovetail with your work at Tendigi? Does it help you think more creatively, or is it just totally unrelated?
It's more related than you'd think it would be. It kind of fosters an internal culture of hacking, of exploring new technologies, of pushing the boundaries. Basically a culture of R&D internally. Whenever we do one of these projects, which we're trying to do, once a month or so, obviously, getting it all over the news gets a lot of eyeballs on the brand, and gets a lot of interesting people calling us who might not have known about us otherwise.
Very cool. Okay, well, Nick, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this interview. I really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to Symfano for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Symfano is a custom engineering shop where senior engineers tackle big tech challenges while learning from each other. Check it out at symfano.com/sedaily. That's symphono.com/sedaily. Thanks again, Symfano.
Wow.